that the Center for Black Literature pays homage this year to the legacy of Octavia Butler, whose writings, Parable of the Sower, Wild Seeds, and Kindred, amongst many others, compelled us to reimagine the possibilities for Black people across the diaspora. This year, we recognize two esteemed writers that have embodied the vision of Octavia Butler and paved new inroads into the brave new world of speculative fiction. Cherie Renee Thomas and Dr. Thank you. And Dr. Jewelle Parker Rose. Okay. This year's Octavia E. Butler Award recipients. In their own unique way and through their impressive body of work, each of them has explored the Black experience in ways that have inspired us, moved us, and made our lives richer because of the work they created and shared. For those of you familiar with the Center, and for those of you joining us for this program, you know through its various programs such as the National Black Writers Conferences and Symposia, its educational programs and writing workshops, the Center, and I should mention the nationally renowned Center, has been committed to its mission of its commitment to broaden and enrich the public's knowledge and aesthetic appreciation of the value of Black literature. Today's program is a continuation of that commitment that goes back decades and will continue for decades more with your support. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Brenda Green, the professor of English, the founder and executive director of the Center for Black Literature, and the big sister I never had.
Thank you so much for coming out today. And I want to first give all praises to the Creator for guiding me and keeping me focused and helping to bring all of us to this point in the history of the Center for Black Literature and in the legacy of the National Black Writers Conference. I want to welcome our students, our faculty, staff, friends, writers, scholars, literary professionals, and to the National Black Writers Biennial Symposium. I also want to acknowledge the president of McGirvis College, first female and sixth president of the college, Dr. Patricia Ramsey. It's so exciting to have a woman leading us. And also, I'd like to acknowledge our provost, Dr. Antoinette Coleman. You are helping to fulfill the vision of the late John Oliver Killens, who had the dream to host a National Black Writers Conference every year. We tried to do that every year, and we found out that we didn't have all of the resources necessary to do that. And so we began to host a big conference over 4 days in the even years, and in the odd years, we host the National Black Writers Symposium. And that symposium either focuses on a particular writer or a particular theme. So speculative fiction is the theme this time. We could not do this without an extraordinary team. I want to thank my team members, the Center for Black Literature Conference Coordinator, Donna Hill, Charlotte Hunter, Amber Magruder, April Silver, Leah Bird, Sunny Anderson, Issa Yulin, our sponsors, our community volunteers, our partners, all of them are listed in your program booklet. This is our first in-person event, major conference since the pandemic. So as you know, interest in Black speculative fiction is growing and exploding. It's in print, it's in film, it's in music and media, and you'll hear more about that through our first roundtable discussion. So I hope that you come away from this symposium inspired by the stories created by Black speculative fiction writers. You gain a deeper understanding of the complexity and the range of Black speculative fiction that we have, and that you engage with other writers and students and literary professionals. So thank you for coming and helping us to make this an historic occasion.
It is my pleasure to open the first program of the day, Diaspora Visions, the evolution of Black speculative fiction from print to film. And today's discussion will explore how the genre includes science fiction, fantasy, magical realism, and Afrofuturism, with a focus on the genre's origins, trends, and emergence in print and films. Today's program will be moderated by none other than Leslie Penelope. Leslie Penelope has been, I'll read her very impressive biography, and she will be moderating the panel. has been writing since she could hold a pen and loves getting lost in the worlds in her head. Her debut novel, Song of Blood and Stone, was chosen as one of Time Magazine's 100 best fantasy books of all time. The novel also won the American Library Association, also won the inaugural award for Best Self-Published Fiction from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association before it was picked up for publication by St. Martin's Press. She was born in the Bronx. Equally left and right-brained, she studied film production at Howard University and minored in computer science. This led to a graduate degree in multimedia and career in website development. She's also an award-winning independent filmmaker, co-founded a literary magazine. She has spoken and taught at conferences and festivals around the country, including the National Book Festival, Baltimore Book Festival, Romance Writers of America, Writers Digest Annual and Novel Writing Conferences, and the Historical Novel Society. And she just told me as we were walking in that she's very recent winner of the Audi Award for Best Fantasy Audiobook. So, yes, there you go. So she hosts My Imaginary Friends podcast and lives in Maryland with her husband and their furry friend, hoping they have 4 legs. They do. Fine, okay. So you can visit her online at www.lpenelope.com. And our moderator today is joining conversation with Dr. Reynaldo Anderson, right? Ms. Jewelle Gomez, and Ms. Rasheedah Phillips. You can read all about them in the work in our program journal, and this is the part in the script where I say, Leslie, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Good morning. So I would just take a moment to allow the panelists to give brief introductions of themselves. So we'll start with you, Jewelle.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Jewelle Gomez. I'm the author of The Gilda Stories, which has been in print for more than 30 years and was the first Black and Black lesbian vampire novel. Was published in 91 and is currently under option with Cheryl Dunye, who directed some episodes of Queen Sugar, to make a television miniseries. And I am currently working on the sequel to The Gilda Stories.
My name is Reynaldo Anderson. I am an associate professor of Africology and African American Studies at Temple University. I'm one of the co-founders of the Black Speculative Arts Movement, an international network of people engaged in this work. And thank you for the invitation.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Rasheedah Phillips. I play a number of roles. I am a housing attorney, recovering housing attorney. I do policy work for an organization called Policy Link, but I'm also a writer and artist, co-founder of Black Quantum Futurism Collective, co-founder of the Afrofuturist Affair back in 2011, and I have self-published a number of books and novels. My debut novel, Recurrence Plot and Other Time Travel Tales, but have also published books under the Black Quantum Futurism Collective. So, thank you.
So to start out, I wanted to ask how you all got into speculative fiction. What was your entry point into speculative fiction in general?
I'm going to go in order.
We'll switch it up. We'll start with you.
Okay. I suppose originally watching television, as a young person, Star Trek, that was when I was in college, but even before that, what was that show?
Twilight Zone?
Thank you, Twilight Zone. Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits were two speculative fiction television shows, weekly shows, that always had interesting kind of moral underpinnings. Certainly the Twilight Zone's creator was very interested in how the culture functioned or dysfunctioned. And so Rod Serling often had stories with kind of moral undertones. And that really fascinated me as a young person. At the time, it never occurred to me I would be writing anything vaguely similar, but it was always in the back of my mind.
I would say two different phases as a 70s kid. Of course, I was a fan of the 2 or 3 black heroes we had, like Black Panther, Falcon, and Luke Cage, Iron Man. I would say more as an adult, I got into it when after high school, I joined the Marine Corps, and that's what made me want to look at speculative fiction by black people as a political thing, because I was upset about some things I saw while I was in the service. And so I read Sam Greenlee's The Spook Who Sat by the Door. And then I read The Man Who Cried I Am. And then I read Starship Troopers by Heinlein. And that was probably the beginnings of it there. So I always look at black speculative fiction that's tied to some type of political project.
Yeah, I've been fascinated with sci-fi and horror since I was a little kid. I remember being 4 or 5 reading things like Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark and My Teacher's an Alien and all these other like kind of stories and Goosebumps as I got a little bit older. Christopher Pike, if anybody's familiar with Christopher Pike novels, I probably shouldn't have been reading it at like 6 or 7, but I was, and Stephen King too. I was just really fascinated by it, and it inspired me at a young age to write my own stories. So I was writing my own stories about Barbie. My teacher turned me into a Barbie and all these other things as a kid. And then when unfortunately, I wasn't exposed to black writers, black science fiction writers didn't have a consciousness or sense that black folks even wrote, especially where I grew up in Trenton, New Jersey, just really didn't have a lot of examples of a lot of things. And so growing into my teenage years, Matrix came out, all those things, I was in love with the Matrix, really fascinated me. But then once I got to college, I went to Temple University, and took AFAM studies classes, the department that Reynaldo's in. And I understood and realized like these books, these movies that I love don't really reflect me. And so I rejected it for a while. And then I went to law school, and then someone gave me Octavia Butler's Kindred, and that changed my whole life. So it changed my whole world. So yeah.
I also found speculative fiction through Twilight Zone. It was my mother's favorite television show, and we would watch it all the time. And then Outer Limits, the same television shows. And I always knew that there weren't a lot of black people, and there are very few black people in Twilight Zone. There are some episodes. I think there's one episode that's all black, and Rod Serling probably considered himself progressive. But when was the first time that you recall seeing someone black in a speculative fiction television or film?
I thought about this question. For me, I think it was Storm. I think it was Storm and X-Men. I think seeing the cartoon as a kid, and then as they started to produce the movies as I became a teenager, and I think it was Halle Berry who was Storm. I can't remember. Yeah.
The original.
Yeah. That is the time I recall seeing a black person, black woman in speculation. And yeah.
I would probably say as a kid, I remember how cute I thought Lieutenant Uhuru was on Star Trek, and then how fly Billy D. Williams looked in Star Wars.
Yeah.
So those were probably my 2 earliest reflective when I think about it in movies or film.
Night of the Living Dead, Dwayne Jones, 1968. And he was incredibly handsome, and he played this really brave character, and the zombies don't get him. It's the white people who get him. And I had the good fortune of working with him later because he became a theater director in New York, and for years ran a theater company. And he used to say, as long as there are black people in these sci-fi movies, we're going to die in the end unless we make our own. And he often felt regret that that was the thing that marked his career, even though it's a film that has become a classic and so many sequels to it have followed. But it really did kind of end his career in Hollywood film. He went on to do some other films for black filmmakers, but he did have a very successful career in theater in New York. So, but he was something. He was something.
So do you all agree with the premise that there has been an explosion of Black speculative fiction in recent years? And if so, how do you see that? Do you see it coming out of just Black people's prevalence in the culture and, our influence in the culture in general, or do you see any other reasons for that?
I think in the past, every time we've had an explosion in Black creativity, there was usually some movement that accompanied it at the same time. You have during the Harlem Renaissance, you have the Garvey movement. In the 60s, Black Power movement, Black Arts movement. And I would say probably the last 10 years, a lot of people like saying, probably starting around the time around Trayvon Martin up to now, the last decade, along with changes in technology and social media, which made it easier for us to connect with each other. Because one of the things that the artists and people that are part of our network, when we have our events around the world, they always say, thank you for helping me find my tribe. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of people are working in isolation and think they're the only one in their neighborhood or community doing the work. So when we have an event like I'm so much looking forward to next month going to do an event in Medellin in Colombia, because until a few years ago, I didn't know how many Black people were in Colombia. And they got a whole, one of their states down is like 90% Black and indigenous, and they're coming out with their Black speculative creations that they want to present, and in Brazil. And so, yeah, I definitely think it's the current explosion is tied to the Black world is filled with discontent at the moment and are thinking of alternatives to what they're presented with. And I think we're in the middle of now a debate over who gets to talk about those alternatives in certain ways and make certain type of knowledge claims, because there are a whole bunch of people that had nothing to do with this work. Even recent as 5 years ago, but now, as my friend Cherie likes saying, they want to race to the front of the shrimp line now to get some shrimp, and they don't have a ticket or a receipt showing that they paid their dues. And so you're going to see that tension, I think, erupt over the next couple months, particularly with the Afrofuturist exhibition that came out in D.C. Next year is kind of starting that discussion between the people who claim to be fine arts versus the people that's been doing this work, serious work over the last 10 years. It's just one dimension of the critique.
Yeah, explosion might be a strong word, but I do think that there's definitely been an increase, and I think there's been also an increase in the quality and nuance in a way that Black people are portrayed in a lot of these shows and films. So just to take, for example, Black Lightning or Raising Dion, which are two Black superhero shows that have come out in the past couple of years. And if anybody watches Black Lightning, it's such a special experience because the soundscape, the soundtracks are all Black songs. It's just blackety black, like everywhere, everything about it is just very Black. And the issues that they're dealing with, talking about gentrification, they're talking about education, all of these different things. So I think it's not only just that there's more Black people in stuff, which is good, but it's not just representation. Folks are trying to go beyond representation and actually pull in our cultural values, our cultural norms, our cultural perspectives and outlooks into these shows. So that's been the thing that's been exciting for me. And as a person who writes time travel fiction and deals a lot with time travel, I've also seen a lot of increases in time travel, Black people time traveling, which is not something I ever really saw before in my life. And just, the trope always is that if Black people time travel, it's always gonna be bad no matter where we go, right? Because, right, so I reject that and also am seeing a lot of, starting to see again, bringing in this nuance that it's not just Black people traveling back to slavery times or traveling back to Jim Crow South, right? But there's nuance in there. So even something like Lovecraft Country, right, where they had, of course, it's in very racist times, but they had this one episode where I can't remember the name of the woman, but she builds a time machine basically and travels through time, and she goes to the Dahomey, she goes to the start of the universe, she just goes to all these different places that is not tied to oppression, right? So it's exciting to see that nuance. There's still a lot of problematic nature with it again, and as a person who writes time travel stuff, I enjoy the stuff I see, but I have I do have a critical analysis of it. So not all of it is good. So like thinking, for example, like the film that Janelle Monáe was in, which tried to act like it was time travel, but it really wasn't. It was just really bad, right? So we still have a long way to go, but it is really interesting to see some of the nuance that's being built into these depictions. It's no longer just Black bodies in a room. It's no longer just Black people who have unknown origins, who don't get a backstory or things like that, but they are actually the stars of the show, and we're bringing in our cultural norms and values and things into the production. So.
Yeah, I really think that what you're saying about movements kind of opening up spaces for different artistic expressions is true. When I started trying to find a publisher for the Gilded Stories, I got so many rejections from the mainstream publishers. It was kind of like, it was inspiring, really. I thought, oh, I must be doing something right. But having come through the civil rights movement, Black Power movement, and the women's movement had an explosion of speculative fiction writers, from Joanna Russ to, what's the Canadian writer who did the thing about the women who wear the veils? It's a TV show. They wear the
Margaret Atwood?
So.
Margaret Atwood, right? Mm-hmm. So during that period of liberation work, speculative fiction was a really big part of the expression of how things could be new. So I just felt like once I started writing, this will be great. And then I got these rejections. And one of my favorite is from a mainstream publisher who shall remain nameless. They probably don't even exist anymore at this point of how publishing is going. But the letter said, the Gilded Stories, the main character is Black, she's a lesbian, she's a vampire, it's too complicated. And I said, well, I'm two of those three. Do you want to guess which one? And then ultimately it was published, by a feminist press. So that was in 91. Since then, what I keep seeing is our social movements have started to coalesce and grow. A lot of it I would attribute to the music industry to a great degree. Hip hop and spoken word, these are things that start to infiltrate, always sounds like a negative word, but they start to spread into the mainstream culture in different ways, so that we have billionaire hip hop artists and who have music that is streaming, and the internet is another big deal because anybody can read or see or listen to any kind of artistic creation across the board at any time. And I think that has made a big difference. So maybe it's not an explosion as much as it is a incremental growth that is kind of, I think, unstoppable at this point, because there are so many writers of color, African-American writers, Latinx writers, Native writers who are creating their visions of social change and things for the way the future will change for us. I find that, when I started writing in the Black community and the bookstore said, well, why do you want to write about that? It's just going to be too negative. And I think that we've now seen you can take a genre and do anything you want with it. Exactly. You can have it represent you, represent what you want, represent what you've had, the history, but also your hopes and dreams. So it took a while for people to figure that out, not be afraid of it, I think.
Yeah, I think that I also write historical fantasy, and I think Rasheedah was talking about time travel and any time in the past for Black people having been seen as negative. And we're seeing a lot of, in the media, there's TV shows and movies that I would consider sort of Black trauma porn. You know, it's all about how terrible everything was. There was a TV show that came out, like Black people move into a white neighborhood, and I couldn't watch it. I had no desire to watch that, but because it was just traumatic. It was just promoting this trauma of the past. And so, you know, my task in writing Black historical fantasy was to find Black joy in the past and to find, you know, communities that were self-sustaining, that were supportive. And I think that's there too, in terms of history. And also agreeing with the cultural movements produce this art that, you know, in 2015, I self-published my first novels because I've heard plenty of stories of Black authors who are getting all the rejection letters. Oh, we already have a Black book. You know, we have that one Black book. We don't need any more this season. And we have this Latino book or, you know, something else. And I didn't even try to go through that. I just decided that there's this history of us doing our own thing. You know, studying film, I studied Oscar Michaud, and who was a Black filmmaker in the 19-teens and 20s and on up, who took his films around the country. And then there's Too Short, you know, people selling mixtapes out of their trunks and doing our own thing. So that's when I, you know, decided to self-publish. And then because there were Black, you know, the editors that I've had at traditional publishing houses have both been Black women. And so as more Black people and other people are hired, they can publish what they want to publish, the things that wouldn't have been published before. So I wanted to ask about the landscape being different in terms of this growth of speculative fiction in the marketplace. Publishers seem to be more willing to do that, and Hollywood also. And do you think it's because, you talked about cultural movements specifically, but people being primed because of the culture and also the hiring practices? Have these cultural movements actually impacted capitalism in a way to say we're hiring more people who are going to then bring more people on?
I would say what's happening just from a project I'm involved directly with, the thing between movements and what you're talking about capital. I'm not upset about, for example, the new AI that's coming out in way it impacts animation, because shoot, they wouldn't hire my folks anyway. So what do I care? You know, I think up until a couple years ago, I only knew about 3-4 Black animators anyway. So the animation industry wasn't really benefiting us, so who cares? The other thing is it's allowed for alternative ways of thinking. Now, like I said, I like Octavia's books. Kindred's not one of my favorite. I don't like the storyline. And so a film project that a young man we have working on it now called Underneath that's going around the country. I said Kindred presented us with like one timeline, but in this movie we got 3 timelines. So they're like choices involved in terms of outcomes in the film Underneath. And the fact that the technology exists now where you can create a feature-length film of good quality for around $30,000 a year is amazing. You know, if you get, you know, if you just raise the funds for it. And then I think what I like about this moment is even the alternative ways of thinking about history. Like, for example, I gave a talk one time, I would love to see a movie about, since we know in history that there were Black people that sympathized with the British during the American Revolution, I'd like to see a film where some type of futuristic Black sympathizer goes back and puts an IUD in the Continental Congress and blows them up and changes the history of the United States. And we're still under the rule of the British Empire, and see how that, you know, just that'd be a fun movie to watch, you know, rather than us always having to go and do something, being a good guy. I like wearing the black hat sometimes, you know. Now that would be a film, and y'all laughing because y'all know that would sell in terms of people going to see it. And that's why that's why I like the weakening power of Hollywood to guide our imagination. It's decentralized, like what they're doing with Nollywood, all these other countries. I don't think it's not impacting it. Like I believe an Indian film got a lot of recognition for the Oscars. I'm glad Hollywood is losing the power to kind of at a granular level impact our imagination. So I have joy in my heart behind that.
Well, also, I think in that vein, it's been interesting to see how media on television has affected us. And certainly during the pandemic, people turned to their television and streaming services much more than they had prior. And I think that has made a very big difference in decentralizing. And of course, a lot of the things that are on the streaming services come from Hollywood as well, but a greater number of them come from independent production houses. Dare I say the word Oprah? But there are more than just Oprah, and I think that will make a big difference with how African American stories, Latinx stories, Native stories get told, because there are these other platforms that, and even FX has a much broader production history than any of the mainstream Hollywood producers. So I think that has had a really big difference in how African American stories have been told and will be told. And I also think that it's also true with writers. There's a lot more places that people can take their work to be published. I mean, self-publishing is so valuable. I self-published my first collections of poetry, and it was very liberating. And I think the number of African American writers who are doing speculative fictions now have places they can go to that are going to be interested in their work. There's a new press that's only about, I don't know, maybe 5 years old, BLF Press, run by a woman, Stephanie Andrea Allen. And she has published collections of anthologies, one of which is Black to the Future. And her own collection of short stories is How to Dispatch a Human, Suggestions and Stories, because she's a speculative fiction writer. So we have more places to go with our material now, and I think that decentralization, as you called it, is really important and makes a big difference.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I first self-published my book of short stories in 2014 for the same exact reasons. I didn't have time, first of all, to be taking 2 years. I felt like I really had an urgent thing that I needed to put out, and just perceived that I would not get very far in traditional publishing circles. And also, it was because of the way that I wrote as well. I write in both, I blend speculative with nonfiction, and a lot of my commentary also thinks about things like housing and brings in my legal perspective as well. And I don't always write very linearly, so a lot of that also was part of my perception of like, I don't think anybody's gonna read this or think it's any good or means anything. So I self-published for those reasons. But now I'm actually trying to get a publishing agent and shopping a book around that I'm trying to get published, and I want to go the traditional route, because also self-publishing is a headache and it's a lot of work, and yeah, and there's something about, you know, being a part of the mainstream and having your work be a part of the mainstream conversation in this way that feels really important to me at this stage in my life. So I am pursuing these traditional, but it's still hard. It's still hard, even though there's more expansiveness in the field. There's definitely more Black publishing agents, more folks in these places, but it's still challenging. Again, especially if you don't write sort of in the traditional ways that folks expect.
Yeah, the tension between the art and commerce, their businesses, especially, the big five, even the other ones, and having the ability to move and be nimble with publishing. So if you're doing things that perhaps are less commercial, then you have all these other distribution mechanisms, perhaps a small press, or like a feminist press, something that's very focused on your ideals and your vision, and then being able to move into maybe a more commercial sphere and reach more people. So Black Panther, Marvel, that's kind of the elephant in the room in this conversation. And so how does the popularity of Black Panther, or do you see any negatives about the popularity of it, and how does it influence Black speculative fiction writers in general?
I would say I'd see negatives and positives. Positives, it helped expose the broader public to a lot of the work we do. But that's the easy part to comment on. The negative part is whereas I looked at a picture I had on my social media from 4 years ago with myself, Nalo Hopkinson, and Cherie, and it was at AWP 4 years ago. We talked about, and we said in a room full of packed people, after Black Panther come out, you're going to see a whole bunch of people rebranding their resumes. We said 4 years ago, you're going to see a whole bunch of people rebranding their resumes, talking about this stuff who've never written about it before. And when you talk about the commercialization, don't leave out the complicity of higher ed in this. Because I think that, because higher ed, well, if you're a faculty member these days, it generally rewards conformity, not coming up with new ideas. And so when I teach my graduate students, and a lot of these young people are like $100,000 in debt, I told them, I said, you all are going to conform to the needs of what you do to get a job before promoting an idea that's not conforming to what your department wants. So that's why I hope settings like this continue to support people who are non-traditional in terms of they don't have to be academics, because a lot of people in our movement, they don't work in the academy. A lot of the people that have the best ideas are not in the academy. And so I'm worried about what's going to get promoted in the academy as part of this work, because I know one author who a couple of us know in this room, and he wrote about some of this stuff, and I think the book is hot garbage. But, he's trying to appeal to serve two masters. I was like, so he can fit in with the other crowd, but yet act like he's speaking to our crowd. And we know that the stuff is not that good, but, the people or the white folks in his department don't know that it's not that good. But because it's talked about in the mainstream or whatever, they think it must be important because it has a certain kind of word or marketing concept on it, And so that's the part where the academy is not even, there are more people in this room that know what we're talking about than most of the mainstream academy. Because it's just gotten embraced the last several years. A lot of people in the mainstream academy would know that they should probably read Rasheedah Phillips' work as a brilliant example of community futures, Black folks and everyday Black people going to work, rather than so-and-so who put something in an obscure journal that 50 people might not even read. So they don't even understand the nuance of what we do yet in terms of what ideas should be rewarded and which should kind of just be ignored. And so that's where the academy is going to be complicit in stifling some of the best stuff unless we keep the movement going amongst ourselves and not desire or wait for their approval.
Wakanda forever. I think it's such a phenomenon. Black Panther is such a phenomenon that despite it being embedded in the so-called Marvel universe, which exists in the head of a bunch of adolescent white guys in Hollywood, has created a whole wave, I think, of thinking about how people of color can look on the screen, the stories we can tell on the screen, and whether it would ever have such an influence that it allows filmmakers to break out of the Marvel universe and do other things, I'm not sure. Because it's always going to be about the bucks? How much money is the film going to make in the box office? That will always be the question when you're working with Hollywood or any of the mainstream production places. At the same time, I think the culture takes from such success a possibility, the idea of it being possible for African Americans to create a contained universe that they then devise and extrapolate from and create more creations. And so in that way, I think the Black Panther films have developed or seeded the ground in many ways. And it will be lovely to see what comes next, either from mainstream Hollywood, which, you know, I don't put a lot of hope into, but from other production companies, independent production companies, who see speculative fiction as a way to tell more interesting, and I say hopeful stories, because I think that's really one of the things that's important to each of us as we've been talking. You know, remember we used to have the race literature, you know, and it all had to be uplifting. I don't think it all has to be uplifting, but you do want a sense of hope going forward, and too much of what you call trauma porn just leaves you feeling devastated. You got PTSD from the sadness. On the other hand, I think there's so many writers creating things that we just, even 10 years ago, would never have considered. Stories that some of them have their roots in slavery, but go beyond that. You know, vampires who are good, like mine, or who are evil, but still have a shape, a different shape that reflects the world that we're living in. So I think Black Panther has helped seed that ground in many ways.
Yeah, I definitely agree with both my co-panelists' perspectives on it. I think it's done a lot of great things. I think it also has some really problematic underlying, just the ontology of the world, the politics of the world that's within Black Panther is really problematic. Even just like the first film, when you think about how it is that they got their abilities to create the technology that they create, right? It's because some rock slammed into their country, not because they had their own, you know, ability to create and develop these technologies. And just from there, everything flows, right, in terms of how the world is structured, and the solutions that are developed around these sort of technocratic solutions. Technology is going to save everything. You give Black people some shiny technology, then they'll do good, right? But then it's also isolated to this specific country, so it's like this Black excellence thing underlying it also. That's just really problematic. But I agree with everything that folks. I think it's a phenomena. It's definitely expanded what we can do, what we can talk about. Although there's still some limitations around even. I can feel when I'm watching these films that they're holding back, right? And that there's things that they can't do because it's Black people. You can't, there's a certain level of violence you can't show Black people having towards white people, even though, right, they got guns. We can't really, we're still using, you know, their technological spheres with, but, you know, whatever, right? Like there's just still a level of which we have to hold back. We can't do certain things because, right, we are who we are. So I think about those things when I watch these films, and they're cheesy to me, but I love them for what they've done and their entertainment value, and that a little black child can look at these films and want to be the people on the screen or want to dress like them, and definitely what it's done visually, I think is just really beautiful. But I hold that other side of it, that there's a lot of problems with the nature of it and what it presents, and that those ideas are getting mainstreamed in this way.
And it makes us revisit classical literature sometimes. I think I was glad to see a couple of my students come in from Philly, like that movie Pocahontas in Space that we call Avatar, you know, that makes us revisit colonialism and all these other kind of things in entertainment, and how you see some of these historical tropes revisited and then how a certain person might see about outlining their future. They think this is what it's going to be, that it will be unchanged from a historical period, and it just replicates itself into the future, where it plays out that, again, even in their science fiction.
One of the things that has been a guiding force for me in creating the stories that I create is the word dreaming. It's a very big part of Aboriginal culture in Australia, but it's also a very big part of our culture in the U.S. for Native Americans, for African Americans. One of the reasons that Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, "I Have a Dream," resonated so strongly here and around the world, I think, is because it was pointing to the thing that helped us survive through bad times and helped us create when we had the opportunity. And the idea that dreams are really important often gets lost when we're talking to our younger people, when we're trying to educate people. We don't often talk about how important your dreams are. And in the 1930s, the surrealist artists, like Salvador Dali, and of that even more interesting artist than him, believed that in order to change the world, you had to first change your dreams. And for me, speculative fiction is a way that we dream differently. And for Afrofuturism, to me, for it to survive, for it to have a resonance over time and not just be, oh, let's just make a little money off of Black Panther 27, is to think about how our dreams are embedded in the work that we are creating and what those dreams say about what we want for each other.
Yeah. I think that one thing is Ryan Coogler, the filmmaker, was able to have a sort of blackness in there that we're not used to seeing in those types of films. And I think even you mentioned Black Lightning, I think of Luke Cage. There are Black filmmakers involved in those, and they put so much Black culture. Either they were allowed to or they fought for it. I don't know the behind the scenes. I feel like it had to have been a struggle on some level to get as much Black culture and sort of the in things. I think of with Luke Cage, if you are Greek, there were some Greek references to the sororities that were in there that people were like, ooh, they made them sit up and like, okay, you really know what you're talking about. And that is refreshing because you don't get to see it that often. And it's elements of authenticity, whereas maybe they couldn't change the structural elements of the history and culture of something like Wakanda because of the corporate underpinnings that were allowing them to make this film. But when we have Black people at the table behind the camera lens and screenwriting, telling the stories and infusing as much as they can of the culture, I think that allows this authenticity to come through in smaller ways, and hopefully it will be able to be expanded upon, and that it is creating these seeds for the future, which is really important. The other thing that your comments made me think of was there's people like filmmaker Steven Soderbergh who will make a Hollywood film so he can make his indie film. He will make a big budget film and then he'll take $30,000 and make a very tiny thing that's close to his heart, and it allows him to keep moving. And those things don't get seen as much, but he's still in the conversation, and maybe someone will watch one of the bigger budget things and then be drawn into one of the smaller works that allows him to have more creative freedom and that authenticity. And if we who are having more access to the mainstream are able to do this mainstream thing and then maybe bring some of that audience into a quieter, smaller work that's either self-published or published more independently with a press or however, that's another way of kind of bridging that gap that we have access to that was probably more difficult in the past than it is now. I also wanted to ask about, we're talking about more Hollywood, American-based media. And I know, Reynaldo, you mentioned going to Colombia and also Nollywood. So do you feel like this prevalence of Black speculative fiction is happening across the diaspora also?
Oh, of course. I know I published an article last fall dealing with like this context and talking about the geospatial Black imagination and Black Panther. And a lot of Black folks here in this country don't understand that when we get to a certain level of success, don't understand how it impacts the larger Black world, how it circulates, and how people respond to it. For example, I thought the Wakanda Forever film was more political than the first one. Now, as a former U.S. Marine, I loved how they made fun. They did the French army in the film. Now, we used to make fun of the French when I was in the service, saying the only thing they were good at was retreating from the Germans. So, of course, that was a political piece because the French government had to come out officially and say something about the movie because the Africans hate the French in Africa right now, and they want them out of Africa. The other aspect of how it circulates around the diaspora is people who practice Islam don't like how Islam is characterized in the first film, even though the ontology, the metaphysics, and cosmology really was not dealing with Christianity or Islam, but it kind of had an echo of that Boko Haram scene in the first film. And so all around on both sides of the Atlantic, there were different responses based upon your Black cultural location in terms of how the film is received, whether it's from religion, language, where it was well received in Brazil. And so it's had different kind of reactions to it around the world based upon the social location of Blackness. And so it's being read, a lot of our creative production now is being read as we need to do what the Black Americans are doing because whatever we're doing here locally ain't working, which is why a lot of, there was an article in the Atlantic where France is afraid of lay wokeism right now, whatever that means. And I know Cherie might speak to that later, where now they want to know about Afrofuturism and all this other stuff, because in a lot of these countries, these people were raised to not be like Black Americans. You know, they cause too much trouble. They always protesting and all this other stuff. But they see, well, they got something going better than what we got, so we're going to try it. And so they're coming out with their own stories of how they tell stories about themselves going into the future now, whether it's in South Africa, Nigeria. There's a large, and that's what is wonderful to see. I know when you talk about going to film, a series I like watching, and I never thought of the Black Speculative being that interested what they have to say in the UK, but I like Marjorie Blackman's Noughts and Crosses, you know, which deals with an alternative world where apparently some African empire has conquered England, so I love it. And so, and I really like that series. And I think the second season is coming out this year. And so, I was able to write the foreword for the first Black speculative British anthology, Glimpse, that came out this spring. So, and they're looking at this post-Commonwealth kind of form of Blackness, of how it moves in the world. That's why I always watch the news. I love it. Every Black country that breaks away from gets rid of the Queen. So when she kicked the bucket, I knew that was going to start a domino effect of them saying we're not going to be with the crown anymore. So I'm really loving so there's a cultural revolution going on in the world that's delinking itself from these previous colonized way of thinking about ourselves, and it's still unfolding. Even as we sit here, from whether it's in Colombia, Brazil, Nigeria, and really the political establishment can't keep up with it. And that's the other good thing about it, because the people can see now that a lot of the people who lead us, whether it's here in America, whatever, don't know what they're talking about in terms of where we'd like to see ourselves as people and how that translates into politics.
I also think that we, as speculative fiction writers, are hooking into something that was always there. I'll quote from one of our honorees, Cherie, from the introduction to her second collection, Dark Matter, Throwing the Bones. She writes, "The desire to alter one's path, to understand how things have come to pass, is one of the most basic human impulses, and over the centuries it has inspired and informed much of our creative art forms, including our literature. Speculative fiction writers share this in common with diviners, attempting to gain insight by examining the unique circumstances of our world and questioning it in ways that challenge and critique our fundamental beliefs, social conventions, and assumptions." So the diviners have existed in all elemental cultures around the world. Certainly, Black and brown people have been included that in part of our culture, even though the advent of Christianity as a tool of capitalism tried to kind of wipe out that part of the culture. But it's always been there. And I think speculative fiction writers, we're tapping into that divining and oracles and that observation of the world from a different place than the mainstream has been feeding us.
I feel like creativity sometimes is channeling. Sometimes you write and you look back weeks or months later and you have no idea that you wrote that. You know, I absolutely think that you're tapping into that, and yeah, that's beautiful. That's perfect. The divination of creativity is something I'm always fascinated by. So we have time.
Words, they start playing the music. We just don't have any music.
Here comes the
So
music.
Dr. Green sends me up here to be the bad guy. But quite seriously, I want to thank you, Leslie, Penelope, and Dr. Reynaldo Anderson. Thank you so much. The brother was so quiet backstage, and then he just blossomed when he came up. Thank you so much. Jewelle Gomez. Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, Rasheedah Phillips. And thank you.